Thank you, everybody, for joining today, and thank you to the crew that just helped us through that. Today, we're going to be talking about really looking at the power of the SBOM. What does the SBOM tell us? How do we take that information? How do we then manage really cybersecurity risk from that? Yesterday at the beginning, there was a great presentation on practical SBOM building. And I believe it was Ian from Lockheed Martin and Michael from Kusari. And they both said an SBOM in a bucket is completely useless. I thought it was good. It couldn't be more true, right? So you get a lot of organizations that may want SBOMs for procurement reasons. They just throw it in a bucket. So what we're going to do today is talk about how you take that information, actually do something with it, and how we work with our vendors and suppliers to really manage risk inside of IBM. So just a quick, it's the IBM legal team wanted us to have this standard disclaimer, basically saying this is all presented on an as-is basis, no warranties. IBM will not be liable for anything if there's anything that people try based on this information. Okay, so just a quick word. My name is John Bergland. I am a program manager within our supply chain security office. I have been with IBM for over 20 years. I've been in this particular role now for coming up on 3 years. And essentially my every day is I'm dealing with SBOMs, right? I'm receiving them, I'm producing them, I'm analyzing them. That is kind of my world.
Thank you, John. Hey, I'm Zadia Alden. So I'm based out of the UK, coming up nearly 30 years in IBM, and in the last couple of years in the CISO office. Prior to that, it was from the open source program office, primarily looking at legal and license compliance. And then more recently, in the last 2 years, it's looking at the cybersecurity through SBOM analysis. Okay, so for the agenda today, so firstly, some business context around why we do SBOM analysis. So as a consumer and also as a provider, we'll talk about vulnerability assessment as a whole, the analysis and the insights that we're finding, the approach we take to the SBOM analysis, and also the automation we've applied to help streamline the assessment. Some of the challenges we see in sharing that information, and also remediation with our suppliers and our vendors. And then I will talk a little bit more about some of the trends and the patterns we're seeing with SBOM noise, and then how we can improve the accuracy of the SBOM content. And then just finally conclude with key takeaways and then open it up for Q&A.
Okay, so I'm going to assume, and I think it's probably a fair assumption at this conference, that everybody in this room knows very well what an SBOM is. And it's all about transparency, right? What are the components? What are the dependencies, the libraries that are really the ingredients of the software? And you know, how critical knowing this is for really managing cybersecurity and supply chain security risk. You know, as we can see, the current environment really driven by, I think, regulatory mandates, security directives worldwide, starting with, of course, the Biden executive order in May of 2021. You know, more recently in Europe now with the NIST directive, CRA coming into full force in 2027. This is the regulatory and compliance framework that we're working within. And this is absolutely driving increasing transparency. Keep in mind the SBOM standards are continuing to mature and evolve, as is the tooling, the ability to take this information and operationalize it is all continuing to mature. So really the net of this is it's pretty tricky navigating SBOMs right now in the corporate environment. Right, you've got to be dealing with all the increasing compliance, the transparency needs. As the tooling for SBOMs is improving, maturing, it's the constant need to go back, revisit the tooling, the processes, and keep coming back and revisiting your security strategies.
Thanks, John. Okay, so a couple of the use cases for SBOM analysis. So one, as a consumer of software, so we work with a lot of OEM and vendors and software suppliers. So we want to look at their SBOMs and understand their security posture. We also work with the mergers M&A team on inbound acquisitions. So again, doing code scans and reviewing the SBOM output from those scans. And then obviously as a provider of software in IBM, so also trying to identify our own components through SBOM analysis, any remediation plans, and insight into aging libraries that we see from the SBOM analysis results.
Do you want to speak to the metrics?
Yes, you're right. Yeah, thanks, John. The stat over here, so the chart here just shows the trend we've seen since 2022. So that number there equates to the number of unique SBOMs that have been analyzed by the program office here. Quite significant.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so looking at the SBOM, and we like to laugh because I think, you know, when you present an SBOM to an organization or we receive one, it really tells all, right? And it's thinking about what does it say about, you know, not only your offering security posture, but potentially your software practices, your vulnerability management practices, and what's this really say about your overall organization? So most obviously, the SBOM gives the ability to scan for vulnerabilities, open source packages. We found at least, for example, Dependency Track, Mend, Prisma Cloud, Twistlock. These are all excellent tools that so far we've found to be very useful. Additionally, you know, beyond just the vulnerabilities, we at IBM are putting a very strong emphasis on looking at the percentages of what are your packages are at the latest release level, what's potentially back level, and then even what's the percentage where we're not able to get a read. Looking at the back level, for example, the emphasis there is obviously, for one, your latest open source library releases, they're going to have all the latest security patches. Two, if they're not even up to the latest state, we're not even obviously scanning that. If there are newer vulnerabilities, that's a gap. We're not even seeing it. Additionally, if there's a large percentage within the SBOM analysis that we're not even able to tell if it's back level or not, that might be a very clear indication that we're not within the SBOM. Maybe there aren't the sufficient unique identifiers, pearls, CPEs, maybe they're missing and it needs closer examination. An interesting statistic, and this is something why we continue to focus on this area heavily. We did an internal analysis in IBM and found that literally 80% of the vulnerabilities identified could be immediately addressed if all of the open source libraries being used were simply up to the latest level. 80%. And Zadia will speak to, I mean, there are certainly tools and abilities to bring those libraries to that latest level. And of course, you know, we are also scanning for obviously the vanity vulnerabilities in the case, for example, Log4j. It's not just are we finding it, but then we have internal abilities or looking, you know, as we analyze SBOMs from vendors, how pervasive is it through the offering? And to what extent is this really a risk? And all of this helps really to prioritize the remediation and prioritize the areas of risk that we're looking at. So a bit of a deeper dive into what we're looking at. So with a given particular CVE, for example, on the left, we're first, you know, focusing on the severity, right? You know, in the case of Zadia, as we were talking about, our primary use case for what we're talking about today is thinking as a consumer of SBOMs, the quality. So what are we seeing in severity? Anything with criticals and highs, that needs remediation before we're going to be willing to accept it. You know, something that I'm sure many of you are also experiencing, particularly with using, say, NVD, if that's our primary source of scoring and severity, is the ever-increasing number of unassigned vulnerabilities. This is due to the backlog. It's been really encouraging here today and yesterday to hear all the different efforts that are going to improve within CVE information and For example, I think we attended a talk earlier today where Jerry was talking about he believes that CVSS score should absolutely be a required field. So, but that issue of unassigned severity is something that's a challenge. And of course, it makes us then look to many different sources for information. The age of the CVE. What is this telling us in terms of how long has the vulnerability been known about? Does this imply that the organization sending us the SBOM, the vendor, they're just not fixing it, right? They don't have the ability to fix it? Or might this be an indication of something that's been fixed, but there's a legacy vulnerability that potentially could be resurfacing? But that's certainly something, the ones that are really old, they pop out and they require special attention. And then of course the KEV association. If any CVEs are associated there, that is an indicator that this has been a real world vulnerability that's been exploited. So those also, we're very quickly able to find out all of that information. In terms of version, as we talked about, is something back level and not just 1 or 2 revs back level, but is it significantly back level? What is this telling us? And might that be an indicator that it's either deprecated or totally out of support? And again, it was encouraging. We just had a session here talking about newer standards that will then really validate within open source libraries what is truly out of support and how to define that. But that's a big area that we're obviously trying to flag and identify any of those libraries. Oops. So Zadia highlighted that statistic that shows just the exponential growth in SBOMs as we, as a supplier, or as a consumer, what we're dealing with in terms of processing. So the key to that all is really how do we keep up with it? How do we scale? And in terms of automation, so initially this is a little bit of a view of some of the architectural components and how we're doing this. So on the left, we've got the incoming SBOMs. These could be from third-party suppliers, vendors, what we call OEMs or our intellectual property partners that are selling software under IBM. All of this needs careful scrutiny, including if we're doing maybe a merger or an acquisition. We bring all this into a platform, essentially tooling that does the analysis. I've cited some of those. And then we take all of that data and we aggregate it. So, what are the CVEs? What's their severity? What's the different percentage of back level breakdown? What are the CWEs? And what are the KEV associated CVEs? We bring all that, and then in an automated manner at the far right, we produce a nice, it's a report, it's a standardized report, customized to each and every, say, vendor. But it's standard, and it's actually generated in a very business-friendly format so that when needed and when appropriate, it can go right up to the top executives. They understand it, as well as then it's got all the technical security detail for the more technical audience. We're also generating a VEX spreadsheet or VEX template, I'll call it. So it's, and maybe, with all the different talks here so far, maybe people are thinking, why are you not just going right to VEX? What the real world, most of the vendors that we're working with, they're in no way ready to receive just pure VEX output and work with it. That's the reality. But they love spreadsheets. They love to be able to see it visually. We want the standardization. So what we're doing by this VEX template, we're laying it out very clearly. We're giving them all a drop down so that they're actually answering then the status of the vulnerabilities in a VEX standard, and then we can take that information and process it all according to VEX standards, but making it visually easy for them to work with when they may not be as familiar with. And we've seen tremendous success with that in standardization. So all of that has been significantly automated, and really we've reduced the time to produce all this. As Zadia will cite, like 95% reduction in time due to automation. Now, so all of that is great, right? We're much faster at producing this. What I almost wanted to draw here was like the coyote and the roadrunner running toward the edge of the cliff. But what we're dealing with here is the challenge is, so we, as IBM, we can generate all that information, that's great. But as we're doing much more, and we're increasing the number of SBOMs that we're analyzing concurrently, the number of vendors, the number of what we're processing, that's all increasing concurrently. And the question then becomes, how do we share that information securely, efficiently, and getting all the data back in standard ways? And that is an ever increasing challenge. So, dealing with the secure transport, this is obviously super confidential information from both vendors and our analysis. Doing it in an efficient way so that it's not too much, human time involved in those communications. And then thinking about the constant iterations, right? We've pointed out the vulnerabilities, but before we're willing to accept that, oh, I fixed that, we want evidence. We need to reprocess, for example, that SBOM. So how to do that iterative remediation effectively and still be able to continue to scale. So we know that there are platforms out there that deal with, I think, exactly this issue. We've had a chance, we've talked to some so far. I think Cybeats, for example, FOSSA's out there, others. This is something we'd welcome with the audience, that we really, if many of you may be dealing with this same exact issue, we would welcome the discussion to learn sort of what people have had success with. But I mean, I know that it's encouraging now to see the capabilities from commercial offerings, and this is a very real world challenge.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Valerie, for the time check. I think we're good for time. Okay, so here I'm going to talk about some of the trends and the patterns we're seeing, which I call SBOM noise. So what do I mean by SBOM noise? So it's components that make their way into the SBOM that actually don't make up the production code or into the product. So it's noise, and it's actually a distraction on where dev need to focus their efforts. Okay, so starting over here at the bottom, so non-production code. So of the SBOMs that we've analysed to date, 22% of those we're seeing non-production code making its way into the SBOM. So non-production code, so these are findings coming from package manager files, so requirements.txt, pom.xmls, and those dependencies aren't actually used in the production code. We're also seeing things coming from the go.sum file. Now, a lot of people use go.sum for their dev dependencies. Unfortunately, we can't make that blanket exclusion because actually we're seeing some development teams using that for their production dependencies. So a recent example of that, we were working with the mergers and acquisitions team, inbound acquisition, and they had 7 assets in their portfolio. We saw from the SBOM analysis, we saw some concerning findings coming from a go.sum. So we engaged in a Q&A with the development team, and they confirmed they were not using those dependencies from the go.sum in the production. Same company, same development team, different asset. They were using the go.sum to manage their production dependency. So again, we couldn't just do those exclusions. Some of the other findings that we're seeing is scanning and config issues. So again, this has been seen in 27% of the SBOMs that we've analysed to date. So this is where we get an indication of what the vendor has scanned. So we inadvertently find test and development code in the production SBOM. So they've inadvertently pointed their scanning tool at the incorrect code. We've also seen configuration issues also. And again, that makes its way into the SBOM, and it's noise. I also want to talk about the scanning as well, about different results from different scanners. So we all know no one scanner does a complete job. So through receiving an SBOM from our suppliers and then independently sometimes running a code scan ourselves, we do see different results, and that is a blind spot awareness to some of the teams that we're working with. Another example is we had the SBOM input from a vendor. We did a independent code scan, and we found a critical vulnerability coming from, I think it was the cargo.lock file. And then when we had that conversation with the supplier, they didn't know about that finding. It was a surprise to them, and their tooling they were using only supported the cargo.toml file, and that actually drives some enhancements with the scanning tool of their choice. And actually, I think it was a couple of months later, the scanning tool they used introduced the support for that package manager. Okay, poor housekeeping. So again, it's always good to share an example. So we found a large number of findings coming from a path in a code scan, and actually it was an end-of-life product that was bundled in the offering, and they just hadn't cleaned up the code. There were a lot of vulnerabilities, and so dev were aware that it was end of life, they just hadn't taken it out of their code base. So we see that a lot where there's dormant redundant code that just sits and lies in the production code being scanned, and it's just not kept up, and poor housekeeping. Okay, vulnerability data. So this account, and I'd say in probably the last 6 to 9 months, we've seen a large increase in the number of issues with the vulnerability data. So 40% of the SBOMs we've analysed. So let me explain vulnerability data. John's made the text very big here for his eyesight, so I have to kind of scroll to keep up with the speaker notes. Yeah. Got it. Okay. So with the SBOM analysis platform that we're using, we are finding CVEs reported, and then when we go and dive a little bit deeper into the criticals and the highs, we're seeing actually some of the analysis platforms we're using are reporting CVEs for unaffected versions. So the SBOM might list version 1.2, but when you dig down into the CVE, it's only affecting version 1.1 or less. And so we're seeing that kind of noise, so we need to try and filter that out. We're also seeing a lot of CVEs reported from the SBOM analysis platform, and then when we have the engagement and the discussion with the supplier or the vendor, they're unaware of those CVEs. And actually what we're seeing is the NVD is still in analysis or awaiting analysis or under reanalysis state. And so the scanning tool that the vendor is using is behaving as correctly and isn't reporting it on those CVEs, but we're using a different data source for the CVE data. So we're seeing some CVEs. So if you like, it's a little bit of a pre-alert to those development teams that may well land on their dashboard. And then, as John's talked about, a lot of CVs we see are not affected. And this is, again, having a discussion about them adopting VEX as to why they're not affected. So that information is readily available. Okay, so given all those trends and the noise that we're seeing, so how can we improve the SBOM? So it's a more complete, accurate view of the production code. So again, the themes we're seeing, so package manager cleanup, so encouraging teams to run the go.got-tidy commands, npm prune, so that actually what we see in their package manager files are actually the dependencies that are being used. Adoption of VEX, I know John's talked about that, having the information or asking for the supplier and the vendor to have that VEX spreadsheet template completed so we understand why they're not affected, and hopefully encouraging them to adopt that so when we ask the next time, that information is readily available. The NVD backlog issue and awaiting analysis, reanalysis, modified. So where can we scrape through an automated way additional CVE data so we get better additional context around the CVE? So if it's a version not affected, having that readily available through automation. And for those large number that we're seeing in reanalysis, analysis state, can we group those? So at least when we have the conversation with the supplier, we can say why they may not yet be aware of those CVEs. So policy alerts and violations. So there's a lot of good tools out there. There's Mend, Dependabot, Cyberbeats that John mentioned, where you can start getting these alerts at source. So if you're committing code into GitHub, you get alerted if it's an aging library, countries of concern. So trying to get those at source so we're not waiting until we see that content in the SBOM. And then continuous reviews, so development are continuously releasing, so we should be continuously reviewing what's in our SBOMs. And also when we have the supplier vendor reviews, If that's not a one time, we would expect them to come back with additional SBOMs as we're consuming additional software from them. Okay, so John stole my thunder on the 95% reduction. So with the trend we've seen in the significant growth, with the automation that we've applied here, we have seen a 95% reduction in the time it takes to assess the SBOMs, which is much needed if that trend continues. Increasing our awareness and through our vendors on cyber hygiene, and as a net result, that improves the product security posture. And then John for the technical.
So for the technical outcomes, I mean, really the automation, the efforts, the efficiencies that we've been able to gain. Again, that 95% reduction, the standardization, right? So we can crank through the analysis and we have a standard output that needs minimal customization for each particular vendor working with us. This, again, it's all about VEX really, right? Trying to get to VEX, that's obviously a key piece of what's making this all more efficient in terms of the information exchange. So, continuing to work with that, our particular template spreadsheet is certainly an initial step. We've made significant improvements in getting that information to also go back per the VEX standards into our own internal systems. Finally, really, we do a lot. I've referenced a couple of times dependency track. We think it's a fantastic tool. We've worked quite a bit with the OWASP Foundation, and we are strong believers in the work that we do in open source and contributing this back. So, I mean, just one, I think in maybe the last, 6 to 8 months to a year, at least 15 plus contributions back to OWASP dependency track. I know we have several members, Melba Lopez and Caroline Lee are very involved with hosting the monthly meetings, also for dependency track and OWASP. So that constant thinking about how can we give back to the open source community. So with that, I think we will now open this up to some discussion and to some questions. Thank you very much for being here.
We have a solid 1 minute for questions.
Sorry.
So is there any burning questions? There's one right here.
Yes, Cisco Corona team, thank you for presentation. It's really like ringing the bell about everything that you talk about, like SBOM anti-patterns. And I would like to talk about another anti-pattern in SBOM. It's versionless components, right? So maybe for some reason, the discovery mechanism can be like not ideal, right? And some discovery mechanism matching was able to find component to the SBOM, but was not able to match the version. So the question is, what is your strategy dealing with the versionless components? And maybe you have some like good practices how to deal with versionless components. Thank you.
You go, yeah, go ahead.
I can take a stab at that, and it's quite an easy answer actually for us. So actually it's just engaging with the development team or the supplier or the vendor. If we're unable to automate the determination of the version that's actually in use, then yeah, it has to be a conversation with the development team to understand that. I don't know if you've got anything to add. No, sometimes you can't, we see it a lot with the Golang, you can't always determine the version. And it's engaging with the dev teams, or where a package manager is calling for equal or greater to than, and and then sometimes you have to rely on analyzing the latest version that's available.
Actually, I'm going to cut it off. I want to give everybody that opportunity. If you have further questions, please feel free to put them in the Discord channel or engage with John and Zadia after this. Let's give one more round of applause.